10 city evictions, outbreaks in shelters, and deaths during the curfew. This is what the homeless population in Montreal has been experiencing since the start of the pandemic. About 4,000 people in Montreal are homeless any given night. This has doubled since the beginning of the pandemic. In January, Local 514 covered homelessness for its first ever episode. We focused on 10 city evictions and what needs to be done to prevent COVID outbreaks in shelters. This episode was released just days after the death of Raphael Nappa, a homeless Innu man who froze to death during the curfew. Here's some footage from the removal of the Hochelaga 10 city back in May.
They're homeless because some have lost their job because of pandemic. Some have been homeless for 20 years. It all depends. If you remember what they did in November at Notre Dame camp, if they do the same, that's going to be a very, very tough day. We hope they won't do this. We are there because they live in this place, and then shelters are not meant for everyone. So we have 300 person that lives in our shelters, and then that's okay, but it's not meant for everyone. So people have all kind of reasons why they are homeless. This is not me to judge why they are homeless. I am there to help them to make sure that this will not stay this way, and then to find apartments for them or to get paperwork and then do all this. But while we're doing this, they need to stay somewhere, and shelters are not meant for everyone.
But how has the situation evolved since the beginning of the year and since 10 city removals this spring? James Hughes, the president and CEO of the Old Brewery Mission, a shelter and resource for homeless people in Montreal, spoke with Local 514 this morning about how the situation has evolved since January. Here's the clip.
So we spoke, actually, I believe it was last December, considering 10 city evictions, outbreaks in homeless shelters, as well as emergency hotels for the homeless. Can you tell me a little bit about how the situation has changed or evolved for homeless people during the pandemic?
So since December, really good things have happened on the COVID front. We have seen a dramatic decrease. I'm going to have to caveat that in a second, but dramatic decrease in the number of cases of COVID positive tests amongst the homeless population since our chat in December. And this is all due to vaccination. So the Old Brewery and its sister organizations, we, as you probably know, campaigned very aggressively for homeless people getting priority access to the vaccination when it came out in January, and public health and the provincial government heeded that advice and did indeed prioritize homeless people. So lickety split over the course of the period, mid-January to end of March. A very strong campaign was waged to get homeless people vaccinated, with public health teams coming into the shelters, the shelter organizations and other homeless serving organizations strongly urging homeless people to get vaccinated once, get vaccinated twice, and it's paid off. The Old Brewery manages the isolation facilities for those homeless people who have tested positive or who are awaiting the results of their tests. We've been doing that for, wow, it's coming up to 2 years now. Can't believe it. And as of March, the numbers of people in those isolation facilities, so places where homeless people can go and isolate from the rest of the population and protect the rest of the population from COVID, have gone down massively. So we've had, more often than not, nobody in the isolation facilities than we've had people. And that's been the case right up until this week. Unfortunately, you're the first journalist who I'm actually reporting that the numbers are now going back up because of Delta. Just late last week and early this week, we're starting to see small outbreaks. The numbers in the isolation facilities are going up. And now we're starting to scenario plan for an even larger increase, because this when it hits the homeless population, it's like a fire in a forest. It goes through everybody, whether you're vaccinated or not. We're getting many people who are double vaccinated coming up with COVID with very few symptoms, very no health concerns, but nonetheless presenting a danger to those who are unvaccinated, of which there are still a great many in the homeless population.
I guess what are the next steps to deal with Delta and new outbreaks that are
Oh
possible?
yeah, no, we need more capacity than we have right now. The facility that we have is coming. We're topping out. We're doubling up people in rooms. If two people have COVID, we can put them in the room together. They're not at risk to each other because they both have it. So we can increase our capacity that way. But we're talking to public health. We're talking to the Ministry of Health. We're talking to the local CS about additional facilities, maybe using the emergency rooms where necessary in the event there are more outbreaks.
In the case, I guess, reflecting upon when you were dealing with outbreaks last time we spoke, is there anything that you've learned that maybe you would like to approach new outbreaks, I guess in general, the situation with differently?
I'm so incredibly impressed and honored to work with the people that manage those isolation facilities, Oldbury staff and partners who together are protecting the population in general. They have adapted themselves to an incredibly diverse clientele. Homeless people don't come, wrapped in the same package, right? They're incredibly different. We've seen people with chronic alcoholism needing to use the isolation facilities, for example, who therefore need to have a managed alcohol program so they can stay inside the building. Otherwise, they're going to go and run around. So we actually had to bring alcohol into the building to make sure that they could stay there, that they were motivated to stay and stay isolated. We've had a partnership with the Projet Autochtone du Québec as well for Indigenous people who need to be also offered isolation facilities. And they have partnered with us to make it as culturally appropriate and welcoming as possible. So yeah, no, it's been, wow, just amazing to see the community sector evolve and adapt and shape itself to the needs of the people and the needs of the city.
Thank you. I know that last time we spoke, we were talking a bit about emergency hotels opening up as the weather was getting more cold. Is this something that we can expect to reopen this year?
So another great question, Savannah. So yeah, we are, it's nice and warm and humid mid-October weather, beautiful weather here, but the cold is around the corner. We're already full. Oldbury's full, the sister organizations are full. The additional facility that was opened up downtown at Hotel Dieu is full. The East End facilities are full. We need more capacity than we have now. We're waiting for some announcements on that. We don't know what they are. We're worried they're going to be like Hotel Plastic Tree last year, where it was just 12 hours of service that are offered during the day. That's not acceptable to us. That is it's not a way to take on the issue of homelessness. We need 24/7 facilities. Hotels are fine. We're good with hotels on a short-term basis, but what we need is recurrent, stable funding and facilities to be able to do the work of getting to know these people coming into homelessness and help them out. We can't do that with just 12-hour services, and we can't just do that by trying to makeshift a building for 4 months because it's wintertime. Homelessness doesn't end April 1st. Mm-hmm. We're very concerned. I would go to say nervous about the availability of additional facilities for the homeless population this winter. And we very much hope that the provincial government and the local CS make positive announcements in this regard in the days ahead.
Mm-hmm. To, I guess, just push you to elaborate on that a little bit further. In her platform, Mayor Valerie Plante has promised if she's reelected, she would want to, end the sleep-only shelters and instead provide 24-hour services. Can you just tell me a little bit more about why this is so important and maybe how this could, what this could look like? Yeah, no, I mean, so the 7 large organizations in the city, Oldbury and its partners, submitted a plan called Un Pas de Plus, a step forward. In June, mid-June. It was submitted to Mayor Plante and her administration. It was submitted to the provincial government as well. And it was based on a set of principles that includes 24/7 facilities that have recurrent funding for 5 years, that have stable, are able to provide stable services to the clientele,
that focus on housing. We are housing-focused organizations, all of us, without exception. We are here to solve homelessness, not to manage it. And the only way we can do that is by having counseling and housing teams helping homeless people on the journey out of homelessness permanently. So that's what the plan comprised of. And we were, needless to say, very pleased to see the mayor essentially adopt many of those principles in her announcement on Monday. And hats off to her for that. More funding on the ground for community organizations to do this work is also very positive. An announcement of additional housing units for the population, also very positive. We're not here to be partisan at all. As organizations, we're allowed to be, but needless to say, the debate around reversing the trend in homelessness from going up to going down requires measures such as the one that the mayor has announced, and we'll see what the other candidates announce in the coming days. Having 24/7 facilities allows us to work during the day on getting identification, getting income, reconnecting to social networks, applying for rent subsidies and searching for housing. And not to mention working on medical issues, mental health issues. Those are the activities that happen during the day. In the evening, those activities do not are not carried on with any efficiency. So we need 24/7 services, day, evening, and overnight, so that we can work with them all the time. They can put their stuff somewhere. They don't have to feel mobile, have to move to another place tomorrow. And they have something to do during the day to work with us. And so we can work with them on this journey.
Thank you. You know, when preparing for this interview, I was thinking about something you said last time, just you know, how essentially all the efforts that you and everyone you work with are essentially going towards eradicating homelessness, because the goal is for, you know, organizations like yours to no longer exist and have the need for what you do. And I was reading a piece you published last month in CTV, and I quote, a person on social assistance in Quebec will receive an average of $700 per month, while average rents in Montreal for a one-bedroom or small studio apartment start at the same level. And these prices are higher in many parts of the city. Would you like to see, how would you like to see housing addressed, you know, especially as we are experiencing such rapidly increasing rates in apartments within the city of Montreal?
So it's so frustrating. Any given night, there are 4,000 homeless people in the city, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. That trend has been going up. COVID has accelerated it. This is largely because we have a housing market which is not accommodating people in extreme poverty who need home support services. The private sector market does not accommodate people who can pay $250, $300 a month, and who sometimes have mental health issues, addiction issues, behavioral issues, right? So what do we need to do is we need to build thousands of units, not hundreds, but thousands of units for this population. And we need to, the provincial government needs to fund the home support services necessary for them to maintain those homes. This is not that actually very complicated. We have more science on it than we have before. We have more best practice than we have before. And we need to get to it. Otherwise, the numbers will continue to go up. It's as simple as that. Frankly, we'll probably also have to start to really put our shoulder down on prevention, because the treatment side of homelessness, where people have become homeless and we try to get them housed, is not nearly as efficient as it could be if we never had them come to our doors in the first place. And the next big, I think, push in our sector, in addition to more housing units for people who are homeless, is housing and support services for those who are at immediate risk of homelessness, of which there are more than we are able to house at the present time. If you think of homelessness like a bathtub, and you have people, water coming into the tub, and you have water going out through the drain, there's more water coming into the tub than is going out of the drain right now, and the level of the tub, the water in the tub is going up. that is the reality of Montreal right now. Luckily, it's not like in Vancouver or in Seattle or in San Francisco. Like, we can do something about it now. We can do, like, if you think of 4,000 people on any one night, like, that's, you can get your mind around that number. We can actually do something. But if it becomes 5,000, 10,000, 12,000 people on any given night, that's in Seattle what it is. 12,000 people every evening. And so many, many more over the course of a year. Then you're starting to get in trouble. It's going to get really tough to reverse that. So let's get to it. Let's take it seriously. These are fellow human beings, fellow Montrealers, fellow Quebecers, and they deserve a roof over their head. It's a right.
Just to put kind of these numbers in perspective that you're detailing in Seattle, if more isn't changed towards the homeless population and our municipal, provincial, or federal government's approach, how far away do you think we are from developing difficulties with homelessness such as Seattle is facing right now?
Well, they have a different climate than we do. I mean, our winters may change, may shape the course of homelessness differently than the West Coast, for sure. But will we see more tent cities? Will we see more civic tension in the streets, like around Milton Park, around Cabot Square, in the East End, up now in Villeray? Absolutely. I mean, we're asking for it. We're asking for it. And for me, to know better is to do better. And right now there's been some progress, like the Hotel Dieu facility that's gone up recently is 24/7. It's working really well. Great teams there working on housing with people, but it's full to the brim. Their two East End facilities are also doing quite well. They're also 24/7. Those reduce civic tension because people can be inside. I know there's still some because people do, these aren't prisons. People can come and go as they please. But it's much worse when they're not 24/7. So yeah, there has been some progress. I don't want to deny that, and hats off to the public partners who have funded those things. But we need to do a lot more, and we need to get to it quickly. As I said, winter's coming. The numbers will go up. They naturally do. But we're already full here. We've been full for months. So we're worried and getting more worried all the time.
Thank you. And I just wanted to ask, I'm sure there's many things you could detail, but in terms of the pandemic, has it exposed certain bad approaches to homelessness, or especially exposed inequalities that maybe, can no longer function in a post-pandemic society in Montreal?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been really, really tough on homeless people on the sector. They've been disproportionately affected by it because they live, in congregate spaces. Their vulnerability has been exposed in color, in a rainbow of colors. And I think the fact that they got prioritized for vaccination shows that they're, that it's been acknowledged that we need to do more than we're doing now. I'm very proud and pleased with that outcome. But at the same time, my sense is, that people in Montreal and every city are, nervous about homeless people, right? Like there's a nervousness about connecting with them, and COVID has made it even more complex and more difficult. Knowing how vulnerable they are to COVID. Do they have COVID? I mean, I can't get close to them. I can't talk to them. There's this worry I have that the stigmatization of homeless people has been accentuated by COVID. These are people who are already discriminated against, in terms of ticketing for things such as public indecency or jaywalking. I mean, they are a huge percentage of those tickets that get given out for those types of civic offenses go to homeless people who can't pay it and who will never be able to pay it, and so who now have another another strike against them, another challenge to overcome to get into housing, because that debt accumulates. They don't pay that. Arrest warrants go. I mean, right? So anyway, I'm in a place right now which is a nervous, worried, concerned place. I'm seeing some good. I'm seeing some gifts, but I'm also seeing some curses coming from this too.
Mayor Valérie Plante has promised to end sleep-only shelters and instead provide 24/7 services if re-elected. Video journalist Aude Simon spoke with Sam Watts, the CEO of Welcome Hall Mission, about the need for 24/7 services. Here's what he had to say.
The good news is that for the first time in my lifetime, every election so far, the federal, municipal, and soon to be the provincial election, all the candidates are talking about this. So we're beginning to see some sense of the need for movement on the part of politicians, because historically, nobody has really owned the problem. Is it the federal government? Is it the provincial government? Is it the municipal government? Is it the Ministry of Health? Is it Welcome Hall Mission? Who owns it? Nobody really was stepping up and saying, this is my concern. Homelessness is something that we're going to resolve at this level. And I think what we're going to get to eventually is one level of government or another that's going to finally take ownership of the issue and marshal the resources, align the services, and help us get the job done. Organizations like ours on the ground have proven that we can achieve outcomes if we have the resources to do it. So now we just need the resources on a recurring basis, not a little bit here, a little bit there. Let's give a little bit to the organization that yells the loudest. That kind of stuff needs to stop, and we need to establish the plan. We've proposed a 5-year plan, and that 5-year plan has a number of steps to it, and it will see us reduce the need for emergency services while increasing the number of people who are in supported housing. All of her talking points were directly from the plan. So I loved listening to that because it was like reading our own document. And she's been very supportive of that. Unfortunately, here in the city of Montreal, Montreal does not have the levers financially to take charge of the problem. And I'm not sure that they're going to get them real soon. I think that's going to largely stay in Ottawa and Quebec. So we're going to have to work with all of the different levels of government to make sure that we can deliver on the plan that we proposed. One of the things that we proposed in our 5-year plan is putting a stop to this notion of we've got some winter services and we've got some other services we put in place in the summertime. It creates a yo-yo effect for organizations like ours. We all know that homelessness doesn't have a season. Just because it's wintertime, that doesn't mean that there's more or less people who need our services. It just is colder outside. And so we don't want people outside and freezing. So what we really need to do is get out of this pattern and mindset that there's a bunch of things we need to do in the wintertime. If we need to do it, we need to do it 365 days a year. So to answer your specific question, we have identified the need for probably about another 150 spots on an emergency basis in the city that will serve the needs of people 24/7. There's a bit of a gap there. If we were all able to fully open all of our facilities that we normally have, the gap wouldn't be as big, but there's at least 150, a need for about 150 spaces right now. And I'm anticipating some sort of an answer to that very shortly. But part of the problem is to get it rolling, get it started up. We were always in this cycle, at least for the last 5 years, of doing things at the very last minute. I mean, you identified it's almost winter. I mean, it doesn't feel like winter outside today, but in 2 or 3 or 6 weeks' time, it could be well below freezing. We certainly had extreme cold weather in the middle of November from time to time. So we can't be waiting till the last minute to announce these kinds of things. And that's been one of our messages to our friends in government, is to say, there's got to be a better way than this. And largely people agree with us, but we still don't have the answers that we need to try and resolve the challenges that are going to face us come November. You know, the reality is that homelessness is not, doesn't spare anybody. There's people from all walks of life. And I think COVID has shown us, I think everybody has kind of come to this. This is one of the benefits of COVID, is we have now all understood that our lives can change radically very quickly. And I don't think for a lot of people, particularly middle-class people or people who are living very well, I don't think they ever really appreciated the kind of sudden stop that could happen in their lives. And in some cases, it might not have affected them financially, but it certainly affected their personal life. And so I think that's been a bit of a wake-up call for people, particularly from my generation. There's a lot of misconceptions that are out there. When a mayoral candidate says that we'll move all the homeless people up to a lot and make them grow vegetables, or when I hear in general polite conversation that homelessness is a choice, anybody who's homeless has made that choice, we got to let them live with it. Those misconceptions need to be dealt with. And just like the misconceptions that existed 50 years ago around climate change, we need to be able to address them so that the general public, the media, the politicians, organizations like ours are all moving in the same direction, and that we start on a pathway that begins to solve the problem. It's a complex social problem, but it's a solvable problem. And so we just need that movement to start rolling. So I'm encouraged that we're talking about it, because that's the best first step. We can decide as a society that we will not accept this, that we won't accept that people fall into homelessness. Now, what I said before is still true. You may find somebody who temporarily is on the outside looking in, but we should have a system, and it's not that hard to put it in place, where that person is welcomed into a place that helps them identify their needs and that accompanies them on a journey to the place where they would really like to be. And the reason I say that it's entirely possible is because in Montreal, we don't face the same size of challenge as exists in most other North American cities. We have a problem, and it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. We've seen and talked about that it's grown a little bit, but it's still at the level and scope that would allow us to solve it if we simply sat down and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to solve this, and we're going to stay at this table until we figure out how. Because the numbers in Montreal are not on the order of magnitude of Los Angeles. I walked through Skid Row in Los Angeles. There's 40,000 people living under expressways there. But I'm Sam, and I'm in Montreal, and we've got 4,000 to 6,000 people that need our help right now. That's doable. And you know, the minute we sort of buckle down and decide this is what we're going to do, and that we're going to put some measures in place to start on a pathway that's going to reduce that number, I think we actually, that's why I'm optimistic. I actually think this is entirely doable. We won't be able to completely prevent people from either making some less than optimal choices, and in most cases, people who end up on the street in more or less chronic homelessness are people that have experienced trauma, or who are struggling with mental illness, or have mobility issues, or who've had a variety of things happen to them in life. And we are quite capable in our society of caring for people who are vulnerable. We know how, and there are ways in which we can do this in a way that's going to meet the needs of the individuals. And frankly, the other thing about it that's maybe a little bit frustrating is that this is actually an economically viable thing to do. Because if you think about the money that we pour into emergency services and everything that goes along with it, policing, dealing with things judicially, prison sentences, you know, cleaning up the graffiti off the street, all of the things that come along with a lifestyle of precariousness, that's expensive. Whereas if you put somebody into their own place and you support them, they become a productive, viable member of society that is buying things, paying taxes, participating in the community. And so it's a benefit to the person, but it's also a benefit to society at large. And so we reduce our overall costs of expensive emergency services. Yes, we'll spend a little bit on taking care of the person once they're in their own place, but they in turn will be able to give back to society. So I just think that beyond the human dimension, which is compelling, there's an economic dimension that very few people examine and look at in any detail. And almost every study I've seen suggests that it's much less expensive to have someone in supported housing, even if you're fully paying their rent, than it is to have somebody on the street. We will always have people who fall into precarious situations, but we need to change a system that was really built about 100 years ago that assumes that underfunded community groups are just going to sort of keep a lid on this problem. And we need to look at it as an urban healthcare issue, because the two primary indicators of your health are, do you have shelter and do you have access to healthy food? If you have neither, there's a very good chance that you're not going to be healthy for very long. And so if we start seeing this through the lens of urban health, we're going to be able to build the right kinds of solutions that fit the individual needs of each person. Everybody is an individual, so we can't group them all together and say, here's what we're going to go do for them. What we need to do is we need to make sure that we have an opportunity to sit down, listen to the needs, understand where the person is coming from, and make sure that we apply the right kind of pathway out of their situation so that we can accompany them along on that journey. And that's a very important part of the process. It's that accompaniment piece that really helps somebody get back into a situation where they are far better off than where they were when we first met them. There's a pilot project underway, which I'm sure you're aware of, that puts together social workers and police to come and to go into situations that are clearly involving someone who's experiencing homelessness or is in a precarious state. One of the things we know about classic police training is that they're trained to go into a situation, address it quickly, and resolve it on the spot. That's the way you deal with a criminal situation. But as we know, people experiencing homelessness are not criminals. Most of the time, they're simply not. And so to go in with that kind of an approach only exacerbates the situation. You need to have the ability to take your time, keep a little bit of distance, listen, let the person vent if that's what they need to do. And so that's the kind of education that certain elements of the police force have been getting, and it's been helping. I've got to tell you that our experience through last winter was that with all of the emergency facilities that we were running, the police were an incredibly important and supportive partner. So when we needed them there because there was some sort of a dangerous incident, they were there like that. But they also were partnering with us so that they weren't overstepping their mandate and their role. Increasingly, the police recognize that we have a role to play, and so they don't need to ride in on their white horse and solve all the problems. In many cases, we know better how to deal with Johnny who's yelling at us right now. And so them walking in and, doing the police thing is just not an acceptable approach. So we're seeing some real progress in that area. We just need more in the way of, the pilot program needs to become a permanent thing. And what we need to do is we need to be able to work more closely with the police officers. The ones that we tend to work with, and we've gotten to know them, they're fabulous. So this notion that's out there in some corners that the police are nasty and evil and they're picking on people experiencing homelessness, does it ever happen? Of course. But in general, the people that we deal with day to day are people who are extremely aware of what their role is and who are trying their very best to be police officers, but also to recognize that we have a role to play in supporting people who are in precarious situations. One answer doesn't fix it all, And we know that we have to go one person at a time, but there are several key principles that we've arrived at. One of them is that it's essential that if you offer services to someone who is experiencing homelessness, that those services be 24/7. It doesn't do any good to open up a day center, open at 9 o'clock, close at 3 o'clock. Where do they go then? It doesn't do a whole lot of good to open up at 8 p.m. and say, come on in and sleep, but we're going to kick you out at 8 a.m. in the morning. Doesn't give you a chance really to get to know the person, to understand their needs. So the principle of 24/7 is really important. The other principle is the idea of a continuum of services, so that you don't just do one thing. You don't just provide an emergency service. You, like a hospital emergency room, if you go in there, they figure out where to send you next. What kind of treatment do you need? Where do you need to go to? And so that becomes a really important thing for us as well, is to develop this series of links that are set up depending on what the person needs, so that they can get from A to B to C and get the kinds of services that they need. And those are two really critical principles of the 21st century that we've been able to advocate for and start putting in place. And I think that they will produce results. We've already seen some good results from that. And the unfortunate part is, of course, with the realities of COVID, we have had a bit of an increase in people coming into the system that's been at a rate that's higher than the people going out. And that's what has me concerned right now. We don't really have good data on what the increase is. What we certainly know is there has been an increase. Is it 10%? Is it 15%? It's not double. If it were double, we'd know it. But what has happened is, with COVID, you correctly identified that a number of resources have had to reduce their capacities. And in some cases, some of them even closed. So with that, there's been a displacement of people who were used to a certain trajectory. So we've created some gaps as a function of the health measures related to COVID-19. And bear in mind that the state of emergency that was declared in Montreal back in April of 2020 was done to protect the homeless population. Now, it's interesting because I'll just do a little sidebar here. The homeless population actually is reasonably well vaccinated at this stage of the game. We've had very few deaths in the population. We've had, I think, roughly 1,000 people between workers and people using our services who got infected at some point. The second wave was the most difficult time, but largely it's gone well. So now what we're facing, as you referred to, is a shortage of affordable housing in Montreal. Because what we're trying to do, obviously, is move people into housing as quickly as possible. And there's a difference. You'll hear candidates talking a lot about social housing. Social housing is not usually, it sometimes is, but not usually the best response for people who are experiencing homelessness. What you need is just plain housing, and it has to have a number of different elements to it. A lot of the work we do is with private landlords, where we provide a rent supplement to the individual so that they can afford to stay there. And then we provide psychosocial support, so we're visiting with the person frequently, and we have a relationship with the landlord to make sure that everything is still okay. That's a system that works. To just give somebody a set of keys to a social housing unit isn't always the best. It works for some people, but not for the majority. So what we're dealing with right now is some challenges in the area of finding places. We used to be able to find places closer to the downtown core, and now we're finding places in Lachine and Pointe-aux-Trembles and Montreal Nord and places like that, so it's not as convenient. And for some people, there are areas they simply don't want to live in because they don't know the neighborhood. So that is presenting a bit of a challenge to us. But at the very least, one of the things that we have is we have full-time people employed here at the mission who do nothing but look for housing. So these are not social workers, because in social worker school, they don't teach you how to find an apartment for somebody. They teach you a lot of other really good skills. But what we have hired here is people who understand the housing market, understand where to find apartments, know what is too good to be true in an ad, and know where to go looking for places, and develop relationships with landlords. So that's something that has been helpful, and it remains to be seen sort of where we go. We put a Band-Aid on something, we see a problem, we jump to it, we try to solve it in an area, and oops, another problem pops up in another area. And it's really not the best way to proceed. I mean, almost anybody would recognize that if you're trying to solve a very complex problem, you don't do it in pieces. You take a step back, you look at the whole thing, you try to analyze what it is and where it's going, and then you determine what you're going to do first, second, third, and fourth, and you do it in a coordinated fashion. And that's been really where the challenge has been, is we need to get away from constantly applying emergency help. And we did it through COVID, and that was understandable. We were facing a crisis. But we don't want this to become the norm for the way that we operate, where we're always opening up these temporary facilities wherever there seems to be a need. This is a very, very costly way to try and address a need. And it doesn't ultimately end up helping people, because all you do is you put the patch on and they have to come back tomorrow for another patch. So what we're proposing and what we have demonstrated that we can do is, when you have a series of 24/7 facilities located in areas where they can serve people in need, and concurrently you have a process by which you can help people get back into housing. So a continuum of care, help somebody go, as I said before, from A to B to C, then you set yourself up where the emergency services are delivered, but that's not the end of the story. I often ask journalists to imagine if our healthcare system in Montreal consisted only of emergency rooms. You go, well, that's nuts. We need much more than that. Well, 100 years of addressing challenges related to homelessness, we've established this very disconnected network of emergency services. And we've only begun to start building this logical continuum that actually helps people get back to where they need to be. And that's what needs the support. That's what needs the effort put in. That's what needs the funding. And governments need to wrap their heads around that and stop being addicted to merely funding those emergency services that you need right now and hoping that the problem will go away. It's not going to go away.
The municipal elections are coming up in November. So what do our candidates have to say about homelessness in Montreal? From Projet Montreal, with leader and current mayor Valérie Plante, she says that she'll double the budget for services for the homeless, bringing it from the current number of $3 million annually to $6 million annually. She's also called on the province to create a 5-year plan for tackling homelessness in Montreal, saying there needs to be a better partnership between the provincial and municipal government. From Ensemble Montreal, Denis Coderre has not presented a plan on social housing or dealing with the homelessness crisis. He instead will provide a plan on October 15th. From Mouvement Montréal, Balarama Wholeness wants to push for broader powers so the municipal government can build social housing without having to wait on the provincial government. He wants to set aside specific land, including the Peel Basin, for social housing. Yesterday I spoke with Adam Amsel, the president of the Milton Park Citizens Committee, on his faith in candidates pulling through with their promises. Here's the clip.
So Adam, we spoke at the end of, at the beginning of this year regarding 10 city evictions in Notre Dame and Milton Park. Can you tell me a little bit about how this situation has changed or evolved for homeless people during the pandemic since we last spoke?
So when we were speaking, we were looking at the first time that the unsheltered community on Milton and Park was establishing new ways of just surviving on the streets. So yeah, like tents in plain sight. Since then, the number of people on that corner has certainly grown significantly. With the ongoing presence of overnight services in the area, there have been a lot of people that are staying there longer, staying there later. And then, of course, as things happen and as it gets warmer in the summer, like people either from up north or from other areas in Montreal are coming to join their family members. So speaking specifically for the Milton and Park corner, as well as the Mount Royal St. Denis corner, we've actually just seen a growing number of people. What's been interesting is to see the difference in the ways those two communities have sort of adapted to that. So in the Mount Royal St. Denis area, there was a warming tent from January to March of 2021. And so there was a presence in the parking lot just behind the metro station, which is still maintained. So even with a large presence, a lot of the people are, you know, like off the street, so to speak, like in a parking lot about a block away, and like people do panhandle and you know, spend their days with friends. But certainly it's not as pronounced and readily apparent as it is on the corner of Milton and Park. And the services seem to be better coordinated on Mount Royal St. Denis. Housing costs have gone down a little bit, but nothing significant. Housing still remains relatively unaffordable. What we are seeing, just the last thing I'll say on a sort of introductory level, is funding packages and really innovative funding packages opening up in surprising ways throughout the pandemic. And now, I guess, not so much for the community themselves, but certainly for organizations and service providers, like wondering how much of that is permanent, how seriously it's being taken. Like, okay, this funding which is now being introduced is stuff that we needed all along, and how much of that, on the other hand, will just disappear after the financial aid for COVID is over and done with.
Could you explain just a little bit about funding packages for those who don't know?
Sure. I mean, so the major funding partners when it comes to homelessness are the provincial government and, in theory, the federal government. I say in theory because that'll often depend on targeted strategic plans like the National Housing Strategy or the Homelessness Partnering Strategy. But generally speaking, because of the sort of tensions between provincial and federal jurisdiction, federal government tends to take a bit more of a hands-off approach and says, okay, like we can give some money, but honestly, it's up to the provinces to fund and direct criteria for various funding initiatives. So an example would be, for example, like a wet shelter. You have the Ministry of Health that provides certain guidelines of what a wet shelter needs to look like, whether it has to have a certain percentage of its funding dedicated towards getting people into housing, like a housing first strategy off the streets, and whatever criteria that they want to have. And in Montreal in particular, because the provincial government has been focusing in areas other than Montreal, a sizable portion of the city budget, well, not a sizable portion, but disproportionately compared to what their expected share of that pie might be, the city, in one way or another, contributes to addressing the problem of homelessness. Sometimes that's through increasing the police budget. Sometimes it's through increasing the housing budget, though not much. Sometimes it's in offering contracts to service providers. So I can think, for example, there's a group called the GTI, if I'm not mistaken, that was cleaning the doorways of commercial residents in Milton Park early in the morning before customers came in order to encourage business and make sure that people weren't staying away from there because they thought that the doorways were dirty or something like that.
On the note of increased police budget, you know, Valerie Plante, she has promised to increase the budget if elected, as well as Denis Coderre. You know, we did see the demolition of a few tent cities in the past year, especially a lot of money going towards police to take these tent cities down. With the promise of an increased budget, does it make you concerned that, you know, things like this will continue to happen and homelessness might be continued to be approached with police presence instead of actually dealing, you know, with the root problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't really look at incremental changes as anything serious. Like Valerie Plante has vowed to increase the homelessness budget from 3 million to 6 million a year. You know, you're comparing that to tens of millions of dollars of increase in the police budget every single year. You have these little nudges in one direction, but unless we're looking at a sincere paradigm shift in how we look at homelessness, how we look at community response, what services are well adapted to do what kinds of work, how many different divisions and units of the SPVM should exist, like whether some of those man hours are better spent in other organizations and using other approaches under different names, even just like the fact of having a uniformed officer among unsheltered or otherwise vulnerable communities is a great way to make those approaches counter effective. So yeah, like I think just hearing something like Valerie Plante saying that she is going to build 60,000 units of affordable housing and maintain the police budget and increase the homelessness budget means either one of those promises is going to be broken, or that's going to be financed by increases in property taxes, which means that housing then becomes more affordable. So it remains to be seen how that plays out, but it doesn't look very promising from Ensemble Montreal or from Projet Montreal at the moment.
Do you have much faith in any political party, in the municipal candidacy or outside to properly deal with homelessness?
Do I have faith in political parties to deal with homelessness? No, I think that social change doesn't come from a top-down approach. I think especially when you're looking at things that are not generally areas of self-interest and are more about solidarity organizing, you're often looking at community, either community resurgence or just grassroots movements, not like, that need to do a very, very significant amount of work to show governments and themselves and their own neighbors that this is an issue that people should care about. I think on a basic level of self-interest, if the majority of the current provincial government's seats are from outside of Montreal, as we know they are, and that without any seats on the island of Montreal, the provincial government can win a majority government, how likely is it that they're going to invest in ending homelessness in Montreal? How likely is that going to be a priority from a financial point of view? It doesn't seem particularly promising. That said, even when we've seen disinterested provincial governments in the past, and disinterested in Montreal, that is, and Montreal being a significant economic factor in the government's ability to do anything, if you then have Montrealers that put their foot down and decide they're going to shut down the city or do whatever they do to exert political and economic pressure on governments and other actors, it can work, but it certainly doesn't come from the government.
With the conversation around homelessness, often and especially with the upcoming elections, social housing is being brought up, as well as promises for more social housing. Outside of social housing, what other issues do you think need to be addressed to reduce homelessness in our city?
I mean, housing is a huge one, and it's a strange sort of simplistic way to say, but the best way to end homelessness is by giving someone a home. That's a really, really simplistic way of looking at that, and certainly there are other supports that are needed, and not everyone's home is, a 1.5 and a welfare check, especially when you look at things like Indigenous homelessness, where the disenfranchisement isn't just a building, but is also from culture, from land, from community, from cultural and spiritual practices. Like, what else is needed to end homelessness? You can look at proper mental health supports, which includes, financing educational institutions properly, and also, reparative mental health. So when you look at, the access to affordable access to psychologists and things like that, you can look at better addiction treatment centers and more addiction treatment centers. It takes ages to get someone into a detox bed and to get someone into a detox program that fits their specific needs. And more generally on that subject, like the specificity of services is really a big thing that's not often talked about. And certainly, when you're trying to do a lot with a little, you have to sort of go for a one-size-fits-all model. But there again, you're looking at how much investment and how seriously the city or whoever is taking the need to end homelessness, right? Like, are we willing to invest in two types of services because we recognize that women and families need something very different from a homeless young adult male, right? So these are some other supports besides housing, which don't exist independently from it, but which certainly which certainly complement and reinforce the ability for someone to exit homelessness safely and with support.
Because you're based in Milton Park, and I'm sure you're seeing and dealing with this a bit, but a lot of the folks who are homeless in Milton Park, they are survivors. Well, some of them survivors of the 60 scoop. I guess to address homelessness within this neighborhood, is there much deeper work that the city needs to do and reconcile with?
Well, I think the city needs to listen to Indigenous voices, and that reconciliation doesn't happen without truth and without like the admission of deep-seated historical and ongoing wrongdoings, but also certainly that like white people can't be experts in what Indigenous folks need. You're looking at levels, just talking about a specificity of services, you're looking at an enormous colonialism with Inuit communities, which is quite different from, a historic and early 1900s and late 1800s residential school paradigm. The North was colonized very, very rapidly in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So you look at a whole different type of deinstitutionalization. You look at suicidal ideation in enormously greater quantities. So the work there is one in understanding the specificity of those communities and not treating Indigenous homelessness in Montreal as one catch-all. And being able to empower Indigenous voices so that leadership within those communities and in support of those communities can happen from people who actually know what they're talking about.
Thank you. I guess just kind of bouncing back to the municipal elections for a second.
Sure.
Is there anything that hasn't been brought up from candidates in relation to homelessness that you would like to see discussed more?
I think the role of the provincial government would be interesting to discuss. Certainly, it's a municipal election. It's not that the municipal candidates are going to be able to be like tough on Quebec, but seeing that there is a real plan to follow through on the promises will require significant financial backing from the provincial government. So for example, for a candidate to run their plan by the current administration and understand the financial feasibility of what they're proposing to do would be refreshing. Often we see this sort of hot potato thing of like, oh, we would love to do this, but the province isn't helping us with this or that, or the federal government isn't helping us with this or that. So, fine, you're the mayor of a city, but you're the mayor of a very large city in Canada, and it's sort of your responsibility to do that sort of intergovernmental affairs work in a way that's not just like asking really, really nicely for something.
And I just wanted to ask, I'm sure you've brought up a lot of this already, but what do you think the pandemic has exposed about homelessness in Montreal that maybe wasn't emphasized on enough before or considered enough before?
Sure. I mean, it's funny, like when we look at the pandemic, there's always if the pandemic has taught us one thing, it's X, and then every single thing is that X. But we look at the huge fragility of any and every one of our social structures when faced with even a moderate shock. Certainly, we've seen that economically. We've seen that with people's wages. Like, fair wages are a great way to get people to a living condition where they don't end up in financial precarity, where they're 2 paychecks away from homelessness. The volatility of the housing market, the extremely predatory nature of the housing market, within homelessness, how badly adapted services can be. So I'm thinking, for example, of the limits of street work, when you have shelters that can't accommodate people indoors and then just are not willing to, or are not trained to, or just don't have the financial resources to expand into street work. The like no plan B thing, right? Every single winter we see different winter measures anyway for homelessness, but this winter was especially like, it took until Nakuset went on national media and was like, look, we just like put up a heated bar mitzvah tent or something and we'll get it done. And then that's exactly what happened, right? But you just look at this like really sticks and spit way that these systems deal with homelessness almost as an afterthought, which is really sad considering that these people are already in like the rut of being neglected and falling through the cracks of so many different services that the concerted effort to then address that is itself a bit of a last thought is quite upsetting. Certainly the use of police as a first and final resort to dealing with uncomfortable situations, including homelessness. You mentioned the dismantlement of camps. Like, you know, you can say, as the city did, yeah, well, we're working with these people. The police are being accompanied by social workers and getting people into the correct spaces. But something we saw really early into the pandemic is the problem with that philosophy is a lot of people go to tent cities and encampments because they aren't safe in those spaces. There's a lot of theft. There's a lot of violence. There are a lot of sort of neo-policing or you know, secondary policing by intervention workers who set up a whole number of rules that people are uncomfortable with, or, you know, feel as though every single one of their movements is being watched. And it, you know, like, I think taking that whole rant and distilling it to one thing is just the deep need for us to be a lot more caring as a society, a lot more empathetic, and just a lot more open to listening to people's experiences and what they need.
Thank you so much. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think is important to consider, especially with the upcoming elections?
With the upcoming, I think that something that would be lovely to see within municipal politics, within conversations around homelessness, is actual, deliberate, and in-depth consultation with the people being affected by it. So certainly we talk about, you know, housed residents in the neighborhood and shop owners themselves feel disenfranchised from the solutions which come from a municipal government that has their own strategic plans, which they only discuss with executive directors of different groups. But certainly the people themselves who are experiencing homelessness are often last minute invitees to these like cohabitation meetings, are not really prepared for what's going to happen at those meetings, aren't given the required context. You get some people who come to those communities for a photo op every once in a while, but the sort of day in, day out work of working with these communities, understanding what their needs are, understanding what is and isn't working, and then adapting accordingly because you trust that people are experts in their own experience, is something that we certainly need to see more of.
That's all the time we have for Local 514. To stay up to date with the newest episodes, follow Local 514 on YouTube and follow CUTV Montreal on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. See you next time.